Why food sucked in medieval times. Boring history for sleep. Imagine you are rising before dawn, somewhere in the shadowy expanse of medieval Europe. The morning is chill and damp, the hearth fire nothing more than a bed of cooling embers. Your stomach grumbles, but there is no anticipation of bacon and eggs, pancakes, or coffee, no rich aromas wafting from the kitchen. Instead, you know precisely what breakfast will be: another hunk of dark, dense bread, washed down with thin ale or weak, tepid broth. For most people, food is not a pleasure, but a puzzle of survival. Nearly everyone, peasants, city, even lower gentry, lives close to the edge of hunger for much of the year. The land yields what it can, and what it yields must last from one harvest to the next. If the weather is kind and the Lord's taxes are fair, there might be enough, but more often there are weeks or even months of scraping by, stretching stores and making do with the least appetizing fare. Grain is the lifeblood of the medieval diet. If you are a peasant, nearly every meal revolves around bread, dense, chewy loaves of rye, barley, or, on rare occasions, wheat. This bread is coarsely ground, flecked with bits of bran, and sometimes even grit from the millstones. When grain is scarce or spoiled by damp or vermin, it is mixed with beans, peas, or acorns to bulk it out, making each bite a challenge to jaw and digestion alike. Porridge is the other staple, a simmering pot of oats, barley, or millet, occasionally enlivened with a little onion or cabbage, but more often as bland as the day is long. If the family is lucky, there might be a drizzle of honey or a scrap of lard to stir in. Most days the taste is flat, sour, or musty from old grain and smoky from the fire. Meat is a rarity. On feast days or after a slaughter, you might savor a morsel of pork, a sliver of bacon, or a bony stew thickened with turnips and leeks. For most, animal protein comes in the form of cheese, curds, or an egg if the hens are laying. The rest of the time, meals are meatless, relying on pulses, foraged greens, and whatever the kitchen garden can provide. Preservation is an ongoing battle. There are no refrigerators or freezers. Meat is salted, smoked, or dried. Fish, if you live near a river or the coast, is eaten fresh when caught and otherwise preserved in salt barrels. Beans, peas, and lentils are dried and stored in sacks. But dampness or rats can ruin a season's supply overnight. Even bread goes stale in days and must be soaked in broth to become edible again. Vegetables are simple and repetitive: cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, turnips, and a few wild greens. In the spring, there's a brief flush of freshness: nettles, sorrel, or wild garlic. In winter, the pot is mostly filled with root vegetables, pickled turnips, or stringy dried beans. Spices are a distant luxury. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, ginger, and cloves come from lands so far away they may as well be magic, and are reserved for the feasts of the wealthy. Even salt, essential for life, must sometimes be purchased at great cost and used sparingly. Malnutrition, hunger, and foodborne illness are never far away. Years of poor harvests bring the hungry gap, the months between the end of winter stores and the new grain. Children suffer most. Many are stunted, sickly, or succumb to fevers that follow. On the heels of famine, teeth rot, bellies swell with malnutrition, and even grown men and women bear the marks of years of want. For all this, food is a source of ritual, celebration, and hope. The harvest festival brings a rare feast. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' days see families sharing what little extra they have: roast goose for the Lord's table, perhaps a pudding or a pie for the villagers, and strong ale to warm weary bodies. Recipes are passed down in memory, not books. The secret of stretching stew with barley, the knack for baking bread that will last a day longer, the quiet pride in making something nourishing from almost nothing. As you lie down to rest, hunger gnawing at your belly, you wonder, how did people endure such monotony and deprivation year after year? What small luxuries, tricks, or innovations brought pleasure and sustenance to lives shaped by scarcity? Settle in as dusk creeps across the village, and let your thoughts wander to a time when meals were more about endurance than enjoyment, and ingenuity was a daily requirement for survival. In the centuries before modern abundance, food in medieval Europe was shaped by clever workarounds, careful planning, and an ongoing struggle to bring even a hint of variety or pleasure to the table. The village and manor kitchens buzzed with quiet activity at all hours. The cook's skills are as much about preservation and frugality as about flavor. Most households keep a porridge pot suspended over the hearth, simmering endlessly, with new ingredients added as old ones disappear. Yesterday's dried beans, today's wild greens, a sliver of pork saved from the last slaughter, perhaps a turnip or a chunk of cheese rennet. These all find their way into the communal stew. Recipes are a matter of chance, tradition, and necessity. For the peasantry, every scrap is precious. Apple peels become cider vinegar. Bones are boiled for broth, then cracked open for the marrow. The tough outer leaves of a cabbage are tossed into the pottage. The soft heart might be saved for a special meal. Even the water used to boil vegetables is reused, turned into thin soup for the youngest or oldest, who struggle with coarse bread. The annual cycle of feast and fast shapes what and when you eat. The church calendar is as important as the harvest. More than a third of the year is set aside for fasting periods when meat, eggs, and dairy are forbidden. In those weeks you eat even more bread, more pottage, perhaps a dish of dried peas, or salted fish if you can afford it. Lenten meals are famously bland, but they're punctuated by dreams of Easter feasts to come. Small luxuries are prized. If you are fortunate, you might tuck away a pot of honey, a handful of nuts, or a few apples dried on a string. When times are especially hard, even a pinch of salt can lift a meal. On rare occasions, the village forager brings back wild mushrooms, sorrel, or a rabbit snared in the woods. These treasures are carefully divided, savored, and sometimes reserved for the sick or very young. Communal feasting is a rare delight. Harvest festivals, weddings, and church holidays bring everyone together. On these days, the monotony of daily fare is broken by roasted meats, pies thick with spice, and mugs of stronger ale. Stories and songs fill the air, and the memory of a single feast may sustain spirits through weeks of hunger. Meanwhile, the wealthy enjoy a different world. In a lord's hall or a bishop's manor, meals are displays of power and privilege. Peacocks served in its feathers, gilded pastries and stews laced with imported spices. Yet even here, preservation shapes every bite. Meats are heavily salted or pickled. Sauces are rich and pungent to mask the age of ingredients, and fruits are cooked into thick pastes for storage. The line between delicacy and necessity is often thin. Sometimes, innovation brings small comforts. Skilled bakers experiment with sourdough or herbs, giving bread a bit more flavor. Brewers develop better ales. Towns near rivers or the coast may dry fish in the sun, smoke eels, or even cultivate simple gardens of herbs, gibbs, parsley, sage to brighten their meals. A handful of city dwellers with access to markets and trade can occasionally indulge in oranges, almonds, or spices from distant lands, though these remain rare. Even in the simplest homes, ritual matters. Bread is broken and shared with reverence, the last crust given to the youngest child or the eldest grandparent. Meals begin with a prayer of thanks, however scant the fare. The rhythms of planting, tending, harvesting, and storing tie everyone together, each mouthful a testament to labor, luck, and faith. Yet monotony, disappointment, and anxiety are always present. Each day's meal is haunted by the question, will it last? Will the weather hold? Will the Lord's taxes leave enough to get through the winter? In this world, every small treat, every moment of shared celebration, is cherished. As another candle gutters and the house quiets, you ponder, what did people do in the face of outright disaster when crops failed completely or when famine struck? How did communities respond, adapt, or even break under the pressure of prolonged scarcity? Let yourself drift deeper into the past, where the dim light of a smoky hearth and the constant ache of an empty belly are the backdrop to stories of extraordinary endurance. In the medieval world, food shortages were not rare events but recurring features of the landscape, reminders that survival itself was never guaranteed. Famine could be sparked by many causes: a wet summer that ruined the grain harvest, a spring frost that killed new shoots, a war that trampled fields and emptied granaries, or a sudden pestilence among cattle or sheep. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 stands out as a calamity remembered for generations. Relentless rain drowned crops across northern Europe, roads turned to rivers of mud, and grain stores ran out before the next harvest even began. By the end, millions had suffered, and tens of thousands had died. For most, the first warning of famine was not the news from afar, but the shrinking contents of the family's storeroom. The bread grew darker, the pottage thinner, children's cheeks hollowed, old people faded quickly, and all became obsessed with the quest for anything edible. Rats, dogs, and even the bark from trees became sources of desperate hope. Communities did what they could to help each other. Parish priests and lords sometimes organized relief, distributing what food remained, opening up church granaries, or suspending taxes for the most desperate. Village bonds grew tight in the face of shared hardship. Neighbors pooled resources, taking turns at each table so that no one went hungry for too many days in a row. The sharing of food was more than kindness, it was insurance, a social contract forged in hunger. Even so, the stress revealed cracks in society. Some fled the countryside, seeking work or charity in overcrowded towns. Crime surged, fields were raided, storehouses broken into, and thieves hunted for a loaf of bread or a sack of beans. There are stories, often grim, of mothers abandoning children, or families forced to make unthinkable choices just to survive. It is a testament to both the strength and the limits of community. In the darkest moments, people turned to ritual and prayer. Rogation processions wound through fields invoking divine mercy. Fasts became more fervent, candles burned before images of saints, and tales circulated of miraculous interventions. A sack of meal that never emptied, a cow that miraculously gave milk. Hope was as important as food, helping the hungry to endure when reason alone might not. Eventually, the cycle would break, the rains would stop, the sun would return, or help would arrive from a distant region with the first green shoots of spring. Hope revived, fields were sown with trembling hands, and the rhythms of planting and tending resumed, more precious than ever. Some who had left returned home, others never did. The scars of hunger lingered in stunted growth, weakened bodies, and memories passed down in stories and songs. In the aftermath, communities rebuilt. Surviving such times bred caution. New storage pits were dug, alliances forged with distant villages, and local wisdom adapted about which crops withstood poor weather, which wild foods were safe to eat, and how best to preserve a precious harvest. Recipes shifted, customs changed, but the lesson was clear. Survival was a collective achievement, never merely an individual one. As you drift toward sleep, think of all those unknown ancestors who faced empty shelves and bitter winters, who found ways to endure and, in time, to flourish. Their legacy is not in grand banquets or famous dishes, but in the quiet, persistent will to share, adapt, and hope for better seasons. Their world reminds us, even in the bleakest years, community, ingenuity, and hope remain the best ingredients for survival.